My name is Scott Ellison. I'm an advisor to a number of early stage startups in the smart city sectors with a particular emphasis on Proptech and Contech.
Okay, now my...
How are we doing? Lynette? We are fortunate today to put a cap on this, this long day of discussions to have a number of experts in building businesses in Proptech in particular. They also have investments in other sectors as well, but we're going to focus most of this discussion on the Proptech area. Rather than getting long-winded and filibustering with an intro, why don't we go ahead and just jump in and introduce the folks who you all came to see. And I'll start off with I see Michelle and Scott on my screen. There's Nate. Okay. Michelle, why don't you kick us off? Dialing in from San Francisco Bay Area, I believe, although you're also a Canadian native and maybe just on loan from Toronto.
Thanks, Scott. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Killoran. I'm a principal at OMERS Ventures. So we're a multi-stage, multi-sector fund focused on Series A, B, and C. And I lead our focus on real estate technology. So that covers residential real estate, commercial real estate, and also construction. Scott's right, I am Canadian. So I was in our Toronto office for about 3.5 years. And then about 1.5 years ago, I moved to the Bay Area to help open our Palo Alto office. And I have been sheltering in place here.
Scott, I've got you next on my screen.
Great.
I guess we're going to cross both the continent and head north, I think, back to Toronto, right?
Sounds good. Yep. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for moderating, Scott, and thanks to Camber for having me. My name is Scott Kaplanis. I'm the managing partner of a venture capital firm based in Toronto called Groundbreak Ventures. Groundbreak focuses exclusively on property technology at the early stage. For us, property technology is defined quite broadly. So we say anything to do with how you live, how you work, where you work falls within the context of property technology. And we've created that loose mandate on purpose because we feel that the way that people are interacting with their built environment is changing and changing very rapidly, especially in a post-COVID world. For us, early stage is defined as pre-seed to Series A. So pre-seed would be MVP ideation. Series A would be companies that are scaling. We have an international focus, but for practical purposes, logistic purposes, most of the investing that we end up doing is within North America. We have 3 investments in the US. We have 7 investments in Canada. And so we are very active in the marketplace. We're also affiliated with a multifaceted real estate firm called the Hopewell Group of Companies. Hopewell is in a number of lines of business. They're based in Calgary, Alberta. They're a home builder, single family, multifamily. They're a property manager. They're a developer, both commercial and residential, and they have a logistics business. And so companies that we see within the ecosystem or that we invest in, we like to engage with Hopewell potentially as a customer, potentially as a pilot site. But mostly Hopewell is looking for ways to improve how they can do business through innovation. So we kind of get the best of being a for-profit venture capital firm with some expertise driven from industry.
Heading south to Mid-Atlantic, Nate.
Thanks, Scott. It's great to sort of be here with all of you. Today, I want to give a shout out to Michelle for letting us know she's on a strict exercise regime, notwithstanding shelter in place. I also worked out on a Peloton bike this morning, just for the record. My background personally is in both technology and public policy. I spent 3.5 years in the Obama White House at the National Economic Council, where I ran transportation infrastructure policy, urban policy, and emerging technology. I come from a 4-generation real estate family, so it's kind of a natural to land at Camber Creek, my venture capital firm. We're one of the leaders in the real estate technology venture firm space in the US. We were founded in 2009, and we do seed and Series A, but earlier and later as the case may be. Our model is really built around a network of limited partners who own and operate real estate assets. Our network has more than 1 billion square feet of commercial, 500,000 multifamily units, and similar volumes in hospitality, light industrial, et cetera. And we use that network of limited partners as a beta lab to test out new products and services before we invest and to add strategic operating value on the back end. We take that very, very seriously, and it's what's allowed us to have a number of strong exits and find great success in the Proptech sector.
Excellent. Thanks, Nate. And back out to the West Coast, I think, but farther north this time. Are you Vancouver today, Lynette?
I'm in the Okanagan Valley today, so a little east of Vancouver.
All right. So tell us about the relatively new operation that you have launched and are building.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much, Scott. And it's great to be here with this group for sure. So I'm the managing partner with Reach Canada, which feels like the back end of describing the larger entity that we're affiliated with. So Reach as a brand is the scale up growth program of Second Century Ventures, which is the venture capital arm of the National Association of Realtors based out of the US. So if I start at the top, the National Association of Realtors is the largest trade association in the world. It represents 1.4 million realtors, which from a Proptech point of view means that we have this beautiful marketplace essentially for technology companies to scale and grow into. So the genesis of the Reach program is really a way to connect great technology companies with that marketplace of 1.4 million realtors, as well as sort of that growing global footprint of the National Association. So NAR has a presence in over 100 countries around the world through bilateral agreements that they've created there. And so logically, it made sense for Second Century to expand their growth program for Proptech companies around the world. So the first component of the expansion of that program was to stand up a purely commercial growth program or scale program in the US. So they are currently scaling their second class of vape companies through that program because traditionally the program would attract companies for both that really focus both on the residential sector as well as the commercial sector. But I think as we're going to get into a little bit more, there are some very specific and individual needs that the commercial sector has versus the residential sector. The expansion continued across the world, and now the program runs in Australia, Southeast Asia, the UK, and in Canada. So we're extremely excited to just have launched our first cohort here in Canada. And traditionally across all programs, we really look to work with companies that are sort of, again, at that late seed, early Series A stage, and similar to Nate, we'll look earlier, we'll look later, but that's really the sweet spot for us. The idea is companies are in market, they've proven themselves to be a real thing, and we're really here to help through that vast network of not only the realtor community, but the affiliated network of the NAR to help those companies scale and grow.
Well, certainly none of us, thank you, Lynette, and everyone, certainly none of us would choose to have the situation related to the pandemic right now, but there are silver linings in it from time to time, and one of those is the ability to bring together a panel like this with folks from a variety of different backgrounds and geographies. Proptech certainly has local flavor, but I think building a company in Proptech has a lot more similarities across borders than differences. And maybe we'll get into that as well as perhaps touching on the opportunities that and challenges and demands that have been created by the current pandemic. Let me mention to everyone that's watching, please join us with questions. I won't deign to tell you how to operate the platform here, but you can all figure it out and give us some questions, and I'll integrate those into the discussion overall. When investors get together, people always want to know not what kind of animal would you be, but if you could give one piece of advice to entrepreneurs who are either considering starting a business or have started one and are coming in to pitch you, what would it be? And we've got time, so we'll even take two if you've got them. Let's go back out to, or stay in Northern California. I'm here as well. Michelle?
Thanks, Scott. So advice for pitching. So first is build a relationship early. So your first meeting, maybe you aren't pitching. I have lots of conversations with founders along their life cycle journey. We love building relationships early. And then when the time comes to raise, you already know each other, because both sides need to get along and really understand what value each can bring before investing. So I think that's one, is start the relationship earlier. And the second one is specifically related to Proptech, that there's certain aspects of real estate where the human connection, I believe, still matters. So I think when you're thinking of what to build and what you're going to create, there's ways of innovating. Sometimes it doesn't just involve fully software. There's ways tech could enable other solutions. And I think just having an open mind to talking to these investors, maybe with a business model that isn't just building software.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Michelle. Before turning it to Nate and the rest of the panel, there's a natural tendency, I think, among some entrepreneurs to be shy about talking about their idea too early, and there's certainly some wisdom in that. Before you actually have a chance to pull it together. But there are a lot of benefits to getting in front of investors, even when you think you might hear, hey, you guys are just a little bit too early for us. We'd love to think about Series A. In addition to building the relationship, it also gives you the opportunity as entrepreneurs to get that person or those people on your periodic, your quarterly update list, and start to prove to them that you're actually doing what you said. Which builds a ton of credibility and helps them when they go through the process of talking to their partners to say, yeah, not only is this interesting and we think it's going to be a big opportunity, but Steve or Joan or whoever it might be told us what they were going to do a year ago, and then have hit those milestones in the interim. So just a brief editorial there. Nate, what would you tell folks?
I just want to first applaud that point. We pay very close attention when someone says to us, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z over the next 6 months. And then 6 months pass and they come back and they say, I did X, Y, and Z. So if you're going to do those things anyway, you might as well tell some VCs you're planning to do it before you start. Because if you come and say, oh, I've done these things, and we're like, okay, whatever, great for you. But if you've done us in advance, you've already now made a good impression. So I think that, Michelle, is a really good point, Scott. One thing at Camber Creek that we deeply value is sort of pluck, for lack of a better word, by which I mean doing a lot with a little, hustling, and demonstrating that you're able to generate results with relatively little capital. You're thinking creatively. You're scrappy, basically. And I think being, we're not based in San Francisco, Bay Area, and I think we love entrepreneurs who have built something with very little and come a long way through kind of grit and determination.
Let's put a pin in that, Nate. I want to come back to that when we talk about building a team, because there's this idea that either you have to be super technical or you have to have 10 years of experience in the sector. And I don't necessarily think either of those has to be true. Often you can get away with just one of them, as long as you have some of these other, less tangible characteristics. And quite frankly, it's another reason why telling people what you're going to do over the next year. This past 12 months, for example, COVID hit, and I had a couple companies that I've been working with that talked to investors a year ago, and they're able to come back to them now and say, yeah, you remember what happened the past 6 months? We only missed our targets by a month. And that in itself gives investors a lot of confidence to say, okay, these guys women figure it out and they make it happen. Scott,
just to
you
build
next.
on that point a little bit. For us, I guess, venture always comes down to two things. It's the dream and the credibility. So that's what you're going into meetings trying to build, right? So the dream is whatever you're trying to sell, the market potential of your idea has to be large enough to warrant venture style investment. Otherwise, there's lots of other avenues to raise money and other business models that you could explore. And then the credibility is the harder point to prove. And I think the nice tie-in here is you do build credibility by outlining a plan and executing on that plan. There are other ways to build credibility too. Who's surrounding you? Have you built an advisory team, et cetera? But for venture, it's always those two things. You're always to be focusing your pitch on hitting those notes.
One other reason, before I turn it to Lynette, just to mention that's unique to this space, I think, and particularly some of the panelists here who have deep relationships with strategics, is that you certainly can't go into it expecting this, but if you meet with an investor and they're particularly excited about you, but you're truly too early for what they've told their limited partners they're going to invest in, you may find out over the course of whatever it is, 6, 9, 12 months, you may actually get a couple of introductions kicked your way from their limited partners that helps them to start pre-diligencing. And also, they're in the business. They've told their limited partners they're going to introduce them to great companies. So it's a win-win. Lynette, tell us what you would tell people thinking about your program that you're building.
Yeah, I come back to how Michelle answered the question, and it really for us is a lot around relationships, right? And so, having that relationship. So have you created that credibility component that Scott talked about? But I think the other piece for us is really, there are two components. Number one, are you solving a real problem? And can you clearly articulate how you're solving that problem? And a piece of that is how well do you know the client base that you're trying to sell to? And I think that's where the relationship component comes in. So demonstrate to us that you've taken some time to understand not just the problem and thought your way through the solution, but you really understand that client base because the needs change. And I think COVID was a really good example, right? Where you can understand what the client base from a real estate point of view needed or wanted, but in a lot of ways that want and need, got accelerated by multitudes through COVID. And so, were you prepared to kind of scale and meet the need where it was when it was there? And so that's one piece that we look for. But, the other component of it is really the DNA of the company, right? And so when you're pitching, do I want to work with you? Do I want to be in this relationship with you for the long term, right? Because whether I'm investing, whether you're part of our scale program, the whole notion is we want to invest in your success. And so we want to know that we are partnering, we're making a good decision on the partnership piece just as well as you are. And so I think for us, the DNA of the company, in particular, the founder and the leadership team is extremely important in terms of where we make our decisions.
Just back to the relationship. Sorry, go ahead, Nate.
I was just saying, being charming goes a long way. Lynette, is that what you're saying?
It's in consulting, we used to call it the O'Hare airport test, right? You got snowed in with someone, and you have to spend 8 hours with them. Is this the type of person that you could actually be relatively happy with? And in this case, it's a 5-year commitment or longer. So it goes both ways. I mean, you as an entrepreneur you're going to be on a lot of video calls, hopefully eventually, a lot of in-person meetings with your investors. And so that matters too. It's a two-way street. Wanted to talk a little bit about Proptech has gotten a ton of buzz the past few years. Nate's firm was one of the early ones in, and there's been a lot of opportunity, a lot of discussion. But I was curious just to hear everyone's take on whether they think that now is different. Are we at a point where we're going to see an inflection point, or we're experiencing an inflection point? Maybe it's created by COVID. Maybe it's created by the iPhones or Android devices that we all carry around. But just to go around the panel, I'd be curious to hear everyone's take on that. Michelle, you want to start us?
Yeah, it's a good question. And when you look at this industry and it's slow to adopt technology, there's a reason for it. Like there's a reason why it's hard. And it has to do with the complexity of the space, the different players. When we think about adoption and why we're interested in this space, actually, when we think specifically about construction, why construction? It's definitely behind. Productivity is a third of the general economy in the past 20 years, but why now? And our view is two. So one is that as technologies emerge, it will drive adoption slowly. And there's some very strong leaders in the technology space, such as Procore, that has kind of started the movement of technology adoption in our view. And project management is just the beginning, leading the way to more and more opportunities. I think secondly is the generational shift. And this is where we're seeing people in the industry more used to using technology. They've grown up with technology and they expect it when they're entering the workforce and when they're coming into those decision maker positions and leadership positions. So because of those two things, we're excited about the timing and the ability for some of the companies out there to really scale. But our view is that adoption is still a big challenge. And the companies we meet that have figured that out really stand out.
Yeah. Let me throw a slightly different question at Nate, which is Michelle just talked about the importance of really understanding the customer. And it strikes me that one of the key questions that people are asking themselves as they're starting companies is who should be on my founding team? And is it important or even critical when I'm going to talk to a Nate, when I'm going to talk to a Scott, that I have someone with 10 years of experience on either myself or on my founding team in this sector, or doesn't that really matter as much?
It's a great question. Going back to Scott's point about credibility, I thought that was very, very well said and articulated. There are different ways to demonstrate credibility to a venture firm, or I can just speak for myself, to me. One is if you've had a successful exit or 2 exits, or you've got a bunch of fancy degrees, like those things establish credibility. But you can also establish credibility by following up with me every week for 5 weeks until I take a call. Cause I'm like, wow, this person really wants to speak to me. They're following, like they care, and so you can for me at least, passion goes a long way. So I don't think that there's one way to prove that you're worth a serious conversation. I think there are different paths. I will say definitively that we routinely invest in first-time founders with not a lot of track record. So you definitely don't need experience, at least for Camber Creek, and we've had great success doing that.
Lynette and Scott, you want to jump in on that?
I would say it helps to have, maybe even be necessary to have someone with deep domain expertise around you. It doesn't necessarily have to be the CEO or whoever the founder is of the company, but having people to draw upon that do have that deep expertise in whatever domain you're focusing on, I think it is critical, because you just can't possibly replicate that experience, like being in the space for 10, 15 years, knowing who the players are, knowing the workflows, knowing how things get sold. Like you need that because technology isn't going to just sell itself. You need to get it into workflows. You need to get it into the behaviors of the space. And so I think you need someone deep there. That would be my sense anyway.
Do they have to have 10 years at Vancouver's best commercial real estate firm to get into your program, Lynette?
No, they don't. Again, we're looking for not even necessarily people that have been in the space before from the founding point of view, but I would align 100% with what Scott just said. You know, it's important that you have mentorship or somebody on your team, whether it's through your board of advisors or your board, that does have, some of that domain knowledge and credibility, at least at the beginning. And I think, the only thing I want to add to what Scott said is, and understand when domain expertise is less required than running business expertise. And I think this is the piece that we are beginning to see in some of the wider reach portfolio is, what gets you to 1 to 5 million ARR isn't necessarily what takes you to 10. And so some of that, that passion that founders bring, even whether or not they come from the space, and even the advisors that you have that give you that deep domain knowledge, at the beginning to set you on that path, isn't necessarily the same expertise and knowledge that you need to take you further. And so I would say that's the only delineation from my point of view is, surround yourself with the right people at the right time and know when, know or have somebody who can help you identify when that switch needs to happen from that expertise level.
Yeah. Well said.
Scott.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
I was going to jump back to your original question, Michelle, if I might, for a second. This issue around sort of are things different now or inflection point or whatever. I'm teaching a course next spring on the history of technology and how it shaped the American city. So I've been doing some somewhat esoteric reading, and I came across this incredible.
Where do we sign up?
I'm teaching at NYU, hopefully. So I found this. It'll be very hard to see from my iPad. Probably it's not going to work. Okay, it's a picture from the 1910s of scientific streets where people were like, what we should do is put different. We should put the telephone lines and the electricity lines into the same conduits. And everyone was like, oh my God, what a smart city. And that was 110 years ago. So I think that people are always adapting technology into the built environment in different ways and always talking, break through this, break through that. And in practice, I think it is basically always incremental. I mean, there's always new change happening. There's always new technology that enables additional new technology. So I'm very skeptical of the inflection point theory of the world. But that said, I think there is always some change happening.
Yeah, Nate, I wanted to follow up on something you mentioned in the context of this team question, which is you talked about grid and things like that are so difficult to measure, but venture investors are somewhat in the business of really understanding the people that they're backing. And I say that because if we were talking about all of this 8 months ago, maybe we would have said, yeah, it'd be great to have expertise in this particular area of commercial real estate or residential or construction. And then it turns out that none of that really mattered the last 6 months. And what really mattered was teams who could pivot, who could be resilient, and who could be smart about what they had started to build and figure out how either it fit into the new world or how they needed to change it in order to fit. Those are the kinds of things that are harder to talk about as investors because it's there. There's no easy test for that. But it does circle back to what we talked about at the very beginning, which is this aspect of building the relationship so that on both sides you can see people how they react to different situations. Wanted to talk a little bit about the sales process, specifically in Proptech, but I think there are a lot of similarities in Contech as well. It's not enough in these spaces, I think everyone would agree, to put up a website and the field of dreams approach and build it and they will come. But maybe y'all could talk a little bit about the kinds of things you want to hear from entrepreneurs when they're describing how they sell their product, or the pain point, or the people that are that they're selling to, and the problems that they're trying to solve. I'll leave it open, and anyone can jump in when they're inspired.
I can take a shot at that, Scott, I guess, to kick things off. I've been thinking a lot about this right now, and I'm not sure if it's about how entrepreneurs sell it to me as much as it is what the business proposition itself is. So kind of went from a point, and this is all very real time, I'm thinking it through, but where I cared about things like ROI as a driver of someone making a purchase decision. Obviously, that ROI has to be very short to capture anyone's attention. So you need to get that, sorry, I guess the payback needs to be very short to get anyone's attention. But I've almost moved past that to this idea that in order to really get scaled adoption of technology, you need something to force someone's hand. So I'm really only looking now into things that are experiencing forced adoption as a direct result or an indirect result of COVID. So a couple like quick examples that come to mind. People talked about the idea of virtual tours forever. Obviously it was a good way to explore a property before seeing it, but no one really invested the time and money to make it happen. Then you couldn't go see a house anymore. Okay, now these companies actually had to invest in it and have platforms to force someone's hand. Same thing where a lot of work I've been doing in sort of the building material space, right? There was a point in time in April where you, at least in Toronto, you couldn't go to a store to get your building material. You couldn't go to a showroom to see something. And so the industry had to adapt and provide effectively on-demand tools for getting stuff to you. And so that is so much more powerful, I think, given this exact moment in time, than talking about returns or anything else. And another example would be like HVAC. Like, of course, you can generate a better return by investing in your HVAC unit, but do people do it? No. Do they have to do it now because there's a different expectation about ventilation? Yes. Like things like that is really where I'm spending most of my time in terms of making the sale.
So let me jump off that comment, Scott, because I think there are two things. One is the broader question of, okay, has COVID changed things, and in what way? But I also could imagine an entrepreneur sitting here listening to investors talk and saying, hold on a second, I thought you were all long-term investors. I thought you have a 5-year horizon. I thought you were all about building for the future. So why all of a sudden, when something, an exogenous shock happens, do you lose your belief in a particular area or particular thesis? Anyone want to take that second one?
Go ahead, Lynette.
Good. I was just going to say briefly, it actually comes back to, some of the earlier comments, and I was going to jump in earlier, but this seems like a really good place as well. But, Nate, to your comment around, keep in touch with us as an entrepreneur, tell us you're going to do X, Y, Z, and then continue to update us on how you're doing X, Y, Z. I think that runway has shortened a lot. And, it was interesting through our recruitment phase when we were talking with companies that were maybe, we had thought were a little bit too early for the program. And as we all do, right, we left them with that message, well, keep us posted because we love what you're doing. And as you move down that path, we want to keep in touch with you. Well, COVID actually, to Scott's point, forced them down that path really fast, but they would send us literally bi-weekly updates. And they were not only accomplishing X, Y, Z, but blowing them out of the water. And I'm thinking about things like, virtual notarization and virtual closings of transactions, right? And some of these things around procurement, because that, to Scott's point, was another big deal where that was kind of a long play and, slow to adopt, when all of a sudden that became really necessary. And so, I think there's, the inflection point is maybe kind of along those lines. And I don't think the pendulum's going to swing all the way back again, right? We've shifted that landscape now. And so whether or not you can meet face-to-face to close anymore, we now have things like legislation that's changed that's permitted it, which was actually the barrier for the technology adoption previously, right? So these companies that were kind of primed and ready were able to lean in, and I think they're going to take advantage in a much shorter time frame of, a completely changed paradigm of society in some areas. And I think that's an interesting thing that, none of us has had the runway to really think through yet, but I think it's really here to stay. And I'm curious if it actually shortens that timeline that we look at companies as investors.
So
Nate, you guys, your firm is close to a lot of landowners and managers, and there's an aspect of COVID that I don't think has gotten a lot of discussion yet, which is we've certainly seen the advantages of the type of work that we're doing right now, the type of conversation that we're having now. And there are disadvantages also, but maybe not as many as people would have thought 6 months ago. And so if I'm a commercial real estate owner or somebody responsible for keeping tenants in my building at a high rate, do I have to start thinking about either new services or providing services in a more seamless way in order to get people into the office? Are you sensing there's a sense of urgency around that theme?
Was that to me, Scott?
Yeah, anyone can jump in, but yeah, Nate in particular.
Michelle, why don't you go ahead and I'll jump in.
Sure. My thoughts on this topic of the office of the future was that at the beginning of the pandemic, no one knew how long it would last. Investing in technology is expensive. And there was also the view that people forget, we'll go back to what was normal. So there was a pause, I think, when people were hesitant to adopt technology. And then as time goes by, these long-term solutions that landlords need to be competitive on the landlord side, just to get their tenants back to the office, a whole wave of technology is emerging. And our view is that the ones that will actually add an ROI to the building. So you can add more rent premiums, or you're going to reduce costs in some way. My view is that there's also a new wave of innovation in this office space. So they'll have the existing landlords offering technology. A lot of it's also going into health tech, which is a new area for landlords to think about. But I think also how we work is changing. And there could be a new wave of companies as new types of tenants, like the co-working 2.0, which I think we're going to see. So it could even be the type of tenant that you're going to want could be different as well.
Yep.
First off, I would say that the desire of any individual person to continue working from home is highly contingent on whether they have young children at home and other factors. And so I think like a lot of working women have had a untenable situation at home where they've been trying to balance work and daycare because, in many cases their partners are not shouldering the fair share of domestic labor. So like, I think your desire to go back into the workplace, it really depends on your situation at home. Like for me, I don't have kids. It's like, this is fine, but for a lot of people it's not. So I'm very cautious about prognosticating too much about the vast declines in commercial office use. And I also think that human beings are most creative when they're actually physically around other human beings. And I think there's a fair bit of research that suggests as much. And so a lot of companies are going to want people back in the office because it's those casual conversations at the water cooler. It's overhearing something. There's a lot of informal information exchange that happens in person that's just not possible when you're all sitting in your separate houses.
Yeah, very true.
I thought maybe Nate's comments
a lot of us
were...
dads have been itching to get out of the house also. What's the old joke?
Of course.
What's the old joke once you have kids? Mondays are the new Fridays.
I thought Nate's comments were more related to hearing the noise of a 10-year-old puppy in my background. So there's that too, Nate. He can't get away from it sometimes.
Wanted to talk about another topic that came up in our prep call, which is around the sales process, making a sale, and the fact that in this area in particular, it's often a multi-stage sales process, meaning you have different people that you have to convince to use your product or your service. If you're providing technology for parking, for example, you probably have to sell the building owner. You may have to sell the incumbent manager that may be doing something related to parking. And then ultimately you have to sell the tenants as well, right? And so I'm curious to hear various people's takes on whether you've seen companies do that well, whether that dynamic is indeed something that you think about when you're having conversations with investors, or if you think you can just, depending on the type of product, you can just look to sell into one area or one layer of that chain. Michelle, you want to kick us off?
The approach that I've heard that works very well is the land and expand. So you start with one buyer, you prove it out, and then you move to other areas in the organization to roll out your product. So a great example on construction sites is selling to one project. So you could be selling to a large GC, but they'll purchase it to use it on one project, maybe move it to another. And if you can continue to expand that way and eventually get to, say, that enterprise sale where you're selling it to the top and it's everyone has to use it below, it's a lot easier. Also, expansion revenue is a great metric that we look at as investors that shows that your customers are getting value from it, and just an easier way to show the traction.
Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I was going to make a couple quick comments. One, especially in real estate, but in other industries also, Scott, your point is absolutely right. There are often dozens of decision makers, and it's essentially impossible from the outside to know who the decision maker is in a big organization. And I think that's one way that at Camber Creek, we add a lot of strategic operating value to companies, is like, we actually know who the decision maker is and are in regular touch with him or her. And we've helped other companies get to a decision quickly. And so that sort of internal knowledge, is one way we're able to really help companies. The flip side of that is, I can't tell you how many times companies come to us and say, we've got this, big real estate company as a client. And we're like, are you sure? And they're like, well, we have a letter that is signaling, and then we call them, and they're like, we told those guys like we'd think about it and get back to them in like a year. So you have to be very, very careful in what you say about your customer relationships with venture firms, because we likely know the people that you're selling to and are going to ask them like immediately. So anyway, those are just two comments.
Yeah, that's a great point, Nate. Scott, talk about how compelling or not this sort of logo slide is. We have the following big relationships, and the logos that are in the top 10. And to Nate's point, maybe one of the founders was in a fraternity with someone who happened to be at one of the large companies. But just talk about how the conversations that you have with entrepreneurs around that issue.
Yeah, I think a logo slide is a good starting point to building credibility. I can tell you what we look for, because you're exactly right. Often there's an immediate network of logos. So most entrepreneurs early on are going to be able to sell, often regionally, to a bunch of the people that they grew up with or knew or worked with if they came out of industry. And that's good. It can help you validate a product or a solution. But show me what incremental relationships you've added beyond that, because I think it's easy enough to understand that. Show me what you've done inside of any of those logos to expand the relationship. And then one thing that we get a lot on the logo page is, here are my channel partners. I love channel strategies. They can be super capital efficient. I think they can help with that sales question that you were just asking. But it's easy to get a distribution relationship. Easy. Everything is hard, but it's easy-ish to get a distribution relationship. But Is there any sell-through? Are the people that you're working with in that channel actually motivated to sell your product? Are they incented properly? Like, show me traction within a channel. Don't just show me a channel. So it's really, any VC is going to go at least 1 or 2 layers deeper than whatever that slide is, but it is a good starting point, and it tends to be a good sort of conversational piece. Like, look, we landed these guys, and to Michelle's point, this is what we've done with them over time. That if you can tell that story, that's really powerful.
I think the only other thing that I would add to that is, I don't think it doesn't matter which vertical you're in the real estate space. It's small and everybody knows everybody. And so if you're going to build a logo slide, know that whoever you're speaking with in terms of a VC likely knows somebody in those channels or knows how to test that really, really easily. And so, it's important to be very clear from my perspective about who your relationship is with. And it's actually okay to say, I have a relationship and it's not yet with the decision maker, but I have a relationship, because that's where, from my perspective, that's a signal to say, well, here's where we can help you deepen that relationship, right? That's what our objective is as well.
And just to add to that, that would impress me if someone was like, well, look, actually, it's really hard to figure out who the decision maker is in this organization. We've spoken to these 4 people, but we actually don't think we've fully understood. What would you recommend? Now I'm like, wow, that person is transparent, honest, has a smart question, like that would impress me much more than being like, oh yeah, they're just about locked up, when in fact they're not at all locked up.
Mm-hmm. As long as they've tried, a few ways in, right? The corollary of that is, don't just ask an investor, hey, can you introduce us to these 5 firms in that first meeting? This gets back to the relationship, and even after an investor has put money into your company, there may still be a lag time until they know, because they understand some of those customers really well, and they know when to make those introductions at the time where you can actually get traction, as opposed to just getting thrown on the pile of all the other technology that a particular company might be looking at. We'd be remiss if we didn't talk about sustainability, and it's a topic that most people care about to one degree or another, and I think many of us care deeply about it. But the question in the context of building companies is, how important is that as a feature of a product, and how do you make it more important, or how do you convince particular constituencies of its value? I'd love to hear everyone's take on that. I would imagine there's a sustainability slide in nearly every deck you see, but figuring out how that really pieces into the value proposition that we were talking about earlier, that gets us to the sale, I think is a trickier question.
So I'll just say this. I think it's super important depending on what it is you're trying to sell. But the key word here is that you would have to be authentic. Just don't shoehorn something in. It's so transparent. If it is part of the ethos of the company that you're building, if it is relevant to you, and that relevance is obvious and authentic, then it's going to come through. And if you're just trying to slap a slide together, it's going to look silly.
I think the other component I would add, and I would absolutely agree, Scott, I think, it can become one of those buzzwords that you have because everybody wants to see it. But if you can't genuinely represent it, then it comes off, it kind of withdraws from that credibility bucket, right? But I think the other piece around sustainability is it's a regional context as well. And I find, at least in North America, it's a nice to have, but it's not really top of mind either. And again, it depends what sector you're in, but it's not really that preeminent driver behind why you would buy technology, right? There's a differential in Europe, right? And so, because we have a program in Europe, a lot of the companies there are focused on building product around sustainability. And so this is where I think it comes full circle to this conversation where, you'd mentioned, Scott, that, technology really has no borders, right? And I think this is one of those areas that, I think we in North America could benefit from, and we're really looking forward to that as, some of the European programs come on stream for REACH, is to really see how we can begin to migrate some of those solutions kind of across border.
Yeah.
Lynette, I completely agree with you with the following caveat that I think that, we're about to have a presidential election, and I think that if Joe Biden wins, there's going to be enormous pressure on, climate change issues generally, and real estate is, top 3 sectors, no question. And there are already some very aggressive, I don't say that with a criticism, just very strong metropolitan regimes in place in New York City, for example, which can be built on. So I think there's a secular trend that may be accelerating if the world turns out in a certain way in 12 days or whatever. And at least in New York City, the New York City Climate Mobilization Act, I think it was called, that might not be 100% right, but something like that, puts very, very strong, relatively short term. I think by mid 2020s, they have to start delivering on carbon reductions. And there's a fine system in place. I mean, it's pretty serious. And New York is, in many ways, the leading real estate market in the country. So I don't think companies that are not really doing anything related to sustainability should talk about sustainability. Like, at least us, we'd be like, you're clearly not a sustainability company. We're not going to evaluate you in that context. That said, I think there will be a lot of demand for actual sustainability focused energy management and reduction companies for the real estate sector. And my evaluation is that the current technology in the market cannot meet the demands that regulators are going to impose. So there's a serious need for like deep innovation, not just like a little better software, but like genuinely new technology of some kind to help the country really meet the emissions demands. That was a long monologue, but
Michelle, go ahead.
Sorry, I would just wanted to
Lynette,
follow on with that, Nate. And I couldn't agree with you more. I think, Canada is in very much the same place. We have some pretty substantial sustainability metrics that the government has targeted to meet, and they've thrown some money behind it, right? So we're going to see some new programs coming on, which I think is going to be extremely interesting. And the question is going to be, are these going to, from my perspective, are these going to be homegrown solutions that are going to pop up in Canada and the US, or is there an opportunity for us to learn, from some of those examples in Europe and other places around the world, and maybe migrate those technologies for North American needs? I think, from my perspective, there's lots of opportunity in that field to play.
Michelle, you have a particularly interesting seat in that right now you're sitting in San Francisco Bay Area, but looking across and talking to your colleagues both on the East Coast in Canada and then even in Europe, where arguably, to Lynette's point, places are much more progressive and about doing the right thing on sustainability. How does your firm think about sustainability in the context of an investment in a Contech or Proptech company?
It's definitely more of the discussion than it used to be. It's part of our thinking when we're doing diligence of that sustainability aspect. I think on the investor side, what's fascinating is that there's some funds who have maybe been more traditional technology investors that are bringing out some thesis in climate tech. And an area that was maybe more of a separate fund focus was on some of the clean tech opportunities. Now it's moving over to some of the more generalist technology funds looking at this space, which I think is going to drive and accelerate some of these opportunities that are emerging. And we're seeing it. I think I've been in pitches now with companies that have a mission focus as well as a profitability focus that meets kind of the venture side. So lots going on there. But as an investor and an institutional investor, sustainability is something that's now part of our process.
Yeah, and by the way, I haven't heard anyone say yet, and few would unless they're particularly impact-driven funds, that simply putting a sustainability sticker on the front of your deck is going to get you points with anyone. In fact, it's important to integrate it into the overall pitch and to be thinking as much about the business model connected to sustainability as it is to whatever else you're doing. And that's actually to the benefit of sustainability ultimately. One of the nice things about green tech is that this second time around, people are sharpening their pencils a lot more on let's put a business plan in place that actually works itself, and that'll end up having a bigger impact long term. We are running up against the last couple minutes of our panel. I wanted to get a couple of questions from the audience in. One of them connects Proptech to more of the smart cities concept. And the question is related to whether you're seeing startups that are connecting mobility and the office space in a more compelling way, and whether you think that's going to be increasingly important as people start coming back to the office.
I'll be super brief. I think mobility is a huge theme. You will see us making an announcement shortly with respect to an investment in this space, both supporting sustainability, but also changing the way people interact with mobility. So unquestionably, a lot of people are spending time in that sector right now.
Awesome. Anyone else? Let's pick up on Deepak's question then, which is actually a good way to close, I think. And the question is, what is the area of Proptech that the panel thinks has significant problems, meaning opportunities, but they haven't seen an investment either for their own portfolio or even more broadly speaking that they think addresses the real problem that needs to be solved? Michelle, why don't you kick us off with that one? I'm sure everyone on the panel thinks about this probably 24/7. This is what you do.
Construction technology is where I'm spending a lot of time right now. So the waves of adoption, anything around digitizing workflows and around data capture and analytics, we're seeing a lot of activity and a lot of really interesting companies that are solving real problems. So I'm very excited about that area. And then shifting the lens to residential, which I also spent a lot of time in, that digitizing the closing process, I think shed light on some gaps, specifically around COVID. And I also am spending a lot of time on the appraisal process.
Nate?
I would say just the general brokerage model around single family homes. I think there are a lot of people tackling it from different directions. There are a lot of people providing great tools for realtors. There are a lot of people who think that they can displace the realtors. Hasn't happened so far. I'm not sure it will, but I think that you're going to continue to see a lot of energy and friction and some political friction in that space because it's a lot of jobs and a lot of people and a lot of money, and it's something that a lot of people do a couple times in their life, and so it's sort of like there's a lot of dynamic issue.
Yeah. Lynette, you just selected a new class. What were you looking for?
Yeah, so I think it's really the combination of what Michelle suggested and what Nate suggested, and I think really it's that desire to create that seamless experience from the consumer's perspective, right? That's really what everybody is trying to do, and I think both Michelle and Nate have identified that it's fraught with friction. There are too many gatekeepers, and some of those are regulatory gatekeepers, right? And so some of those barriers are starting to come down, but it is a slow process. And some of those are even just demographic barriers. We have a generation that is coming out of home ownership that didn't know technology. We have a generation coming into home ownership and just ownership in general that loves technology. And so we have that dynamic that you're trying to balance, as well as that middle component that's representing and advising and guiding that also has those two dynamics. So I think, we're in this weird period of time where it's about allowing that shift to happen. But I really think that's where the gaps are and where the big issues are and the opportunities are, is to create that seamless experience for the consumer from beginning to end.
Yeah. Scott.
I got two themes where I'd love to find something to invest in. The first one, which Michelle can probably appreciate, reimagining senior living. I think that's a big one where I haven't found anything that anyone doing something particularly creative. Is probably a built environment / software combination. And then there are companies in this latter space, but I think it's going to be more important, and that's effectively some kind of a platform that feels like Airbnb for retail, to deal with the retail footprint that exists and figuring out how to tie in digital brands. So those are my two areas. If anyone sees anything, please feel free to pass it across.
Yeah. Nothing wrong with a party round. We'll get all four of the panelists into one company. Well, we've hit our time limit. Thank you very much, Michelle, Nate, Lynette, Scott, and certainly Tom and Thomas and Jerry and the whole crew at Camber for putting this together.